Welcome back everyone. Let's go ahead and take a look at the iPad mini 5 and see how this iPad holds up in 2022. Now what I will definitely tell you is that this iPad is a decent iPad still, I don't think it's a horrible iPad. I think it still has a lot of capability. I will tell you though, with something like the iPad mini 6, this is probably the iPad I would recommend a lot more people to pick up. Now the reason I say that is mostly because the iPad mini 5, in my opinion, was that last iteration from Apple where they just wanted to get everything off the table. They just wanted to go ahead and make this other stopgap year in order for them to go ahead and create a way better iPad like the iPad mini 6 that definitely has its own problems, but I would definitely tell you, if you're in the situation, go pick up an iPad mini 6, but the iPad mini 5 is still a really decent iPad for sure. Now this iPad came out in 2019, so it's actually over 3 years old right now, and funny enough with this iPad, and in my opinion, this was actually, one of the biggest gaps they've ever made from one iPad to the other. I think the iPad mini 4 came out in like 2015, so there was 4 years between them, and the iPad mini 4 didn't even have that good of a chipset to last that long. So I'm glad they eventually released the mini 5, and they come out in a couple cool colors. You had space gray, you had silver, then you had gold, which I love that gold color so much. On the front though, you had that 7.9-inch Retina panel. Now personally, I think these panels are still good. I'm glad that the iPad mini 6 got rid of a lot of that bezel around it, which I'm really happy about. You still have Touch ID on this thing, you have a front camera, which is great. The panel itself is fine though. I truly do feel like with almost every single panel that Apple has made on their iPads, they've looked phenomenal, and even now in 2022, they still look really good in my opinion. Now you have a lightning port on the bottom of this thing, no USB Type-C, you have a headphone jack on this thing as well, and on the back you have the full aluminum back. Now, as I mentioned, in a lot of other videos, I don't think Apple's ever made a cheap feeling iPad. Every single iPad they've ever made, it's felt extremely premium, and this one included. This thing feels extremely good in the hand, it looks extremely good in the hand, and even though it has a little bit of a dated design, it doesn't feel cheap, and the performance of this thing is actually pretty interesting. So, in terms of the outside, that kind of covers it up there. Now in terms of the camera, this is where things are a little bit more interesting. So on the back you have an 8 megapixel single lens, and on the front you have a 7 megapixel lens. So typically what happens, it pretty much had the same camera on the back as the iPad mini 4, but you actually had a little bit of an upgraded camera on the front. And the best thing about iPads in my opinion is that if they're just laying around, it's just like having an extra camera there. I don't think anybody's going out of their way to go buy an iPad because of the camera, but when you have a better camera like the M1 iPad Pros or something, you are getting a really solid lens. With this type of camera, I would think of it as like, oh, if I don't have anything around me, if I don't even have like an iPhone 8 laying around or iPhone 10, having a camera like this, I guess that's not a bad option. This camera though is still really good if you're trying to take FaceTime calls or anything like that. So that may be something, if you're interested in, that may be something that may interest you, is to go ahead, and if you want to go ahead and do like certain calls, if you want to do X, Y, and Z, well, you can go ahead and do that with this type of iPad. But do keep in mind that really your iPhone 10 is going to have a better camera than this thing. I think an iPhone 7 Plus camera is probably going to be better than this thing as well. So definitely keep that in mind. But the iPad mini 5 wasn't being sold because of the camera. It was just an extra feature at the end of the day, in my opinion. And I'm glad they put a decent camera setup on this thing, at least, at the end of the day. So in terms of that kind of covers it up there. Now in terms of software, this thing is still supported with software, and the way Apple goes ahead and pushes out their updates for these devices, for those of you who don't know, Apple pretty much will push out these updates dependent on the chipset inside. So what does that mean? Well, essentially Apple will go ahead and, let's say an iPhone has, the same chipset as an iPhone 10. Well, Apple will go ahead and continue to support that iPad for as long as the iPhone 10 is supported with software. So why is that important? Well, this thing has the same chipset inside as the iPhone XS, XR, and XS Max. So those phones came out in 2018, and although the iPad mini 5 came out in 2019, the chances are likely that the iPad mini 5 is probably going to last as long as the iPhone XS, XS Max, and iPhone XR. There have been a lot of times, like with the iPad mini 4, where they end up getting much longer lasting support, but that typically doesn't happen all the time. It could happen again, I don't know, but I feel like if it were to happen, it could happen on the iPad mini 5, just because it did happen with the previous generation. So if you want a long-lasting iPad, this may be it for you potentially. We don't know for 100% fact, but I guess we'll see what happens in the future. I also want to state that the software that this thing is running with, like iPadOS 14, 15, and in the future updates, these are very good versions of software. iPadOS has always been pretty solid. I will say that with something like iPadOS 14, it was better than iPadOS 15 and I think a lot more stable. But hopefully with iPadOS 16, it's going to be bringing a lot more to the table. And I guess we'll see what happens when we get to that point. Now, internally, like I mentioned, this thing does have that Apple A12 chip inside of it. So when it comes down to the performance side, you are almost going to be getting the same type of performance as you would get from something like a, iPhone XS or, around the iPhone 10 or 10s. So personally, whenever I use something even like any of the iPad minis, but with the iPad mini 5 specifically, as I mentioned before, this is still a very solid performing phone for the most part. An iPad mini, a tablet, not like a phone, but the iPad mini 5, for the most part, still has a really good amount of performance within it. And there have been a lot of iPads that I've personally had that even have the Apple A10 Fusion chip inside, like that iPad Pro 10.5 inch, and that chipset is still very good as well. Another thing I also want to note is that with the iPad mini 5, this chipset is kind of the same one that was in the iPad Pro 3 and the iPad Pro 4. So the original, 11 inch, kind of bezel-less iPad, that thing had an extension of this chip. I think that was like the A12Z or A12X, and then the iPad Pro 4 had the A12XZ. So although those are way better performing iPads and they have way better performance and just, more RAM, all that good stuff, the A12 chip on the iPad mini 5, I think is still pretty decent. I do also think that the iPad 9th generation that Apple just made, it has that Apple A13 chip inside of it. So even though this one is, a few years old now, Apple is still kind of playing in this realm. So definitely keep that in mind. I think the iPad mini 6 has an A15 in it now. So if you want a better iPad, go for the iPad mini 6. If you can get this one on a deal, then I would say go for it. But I think the performance of this thing is still pretty decent. Again, I'm not saying, it's way better than the other one. I think it's, expected what you're getting from this thing. Don't spend $1,000 on this thing. If you're getting it for like a few $100s, I think the performance is pretty decent for the price tag. So in terms of that kind of covers it up there. Now in terms of battery, I definitely do think that the battery life of this thing could have been better. I think the A12 chip was pretty decent for the battery performance and everything, but if you want a better, battery on your iPad, you may want to go for the iPad 9. That is definitely going to be giving you a better battery. You can also go for the iPad Pros as well. Now in terms of accessories, these things, support the Apple Pencil 1. You can get these things with 4G LTE, which is very interesting, and there really weren't any like Magic Keyboard accessories specifically for this iPad mini, but you can always connect Bluetooth keyboards and Bluetooth mouses to this specific iPad too, if you want to do any gaming or anything like that. So ultimately, to kind of sum up this video, I think the iPad mini 5 is still worth it in 2022 by all means. I don't think this is a bad iPad. However, I do think there are probably some better options out there. When I look at like the iPad 9th generation that you can get for $299 if you're a student or $329 if you're not a student, I think that's probably a better option for most people out there. I think when I look at something like the iPad mini 5, I think this is great if you already have it, and I think it's good if you want to go and buy it, if you want to go in the used market. If you're spending more than $300 on this thing though, I just would feel more comfortable recommending the iPad 9th generation. The thing has, a newer chipset than this thing, it's still performing pretty much the same as this thing as well. It has a better front-facing camera too, and it is a bigger iPad, which I kind of do like, and you're probably going to be getting better battery life from the iPad 9. I think the iPad mini 5 is still good for the most part, but if you have the opportunity to, and if you're interested in it, I would probably recommend looking at the iPad 9 and seeing if you want to buy that iPad instead. So that kind of covers it up for the most part. If you have any other questions or anything, let me know in the comment section below. Hit the like button, that would mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.